I think we're at a critical juncture, not just in the U.S. economy and in the U.S. financial markets, but globally. We forget that the global financial crisis was not as enveloping, I would say, as the current episode is and is going to be. We always had China as a backstop for the global economy to come in and be the marginal buyer of you name the commodity as they were growing out their country and building their middle class. That's really not with us right now. And I think that is going alone to be a major factor in determining how long and drawn out the current downturn is going to be in the United States and in the rest of the world. So we are definitely, I think, in a global recession right now. That's the best way to term it. It's interesting that here in the United States, many have continued to debate whether or not we're in recession or not. I go to a very easy barometer that anybody who's watching can follow, a website called dailyjobcuts.com. So this is the beginning of November, and we already have more job cuts that have been announced this far into November than we had in the months of October and September combined. So the dreaded layoff cycle that seems like it was not going to arrive is actually with us now. And it's emanating outside of the bounds of Silicon Valley, where I think a lot of people had hoped the layoff cycle would be contained. We're now seeing beyond even mortgage lenders and what have you, beyond that scope of layoffs, we are seeing a broadening out in across all industries in the layoff cycle. And I think that's going to make it very real for people who had been hoping for a soft landing. Now there's an unusually protracted lag because of many of the vestiges, the legacy of the pandemic. We've lost quite a few people who used to be in the workforce. Coming out of the global financial crisis, for example, one of the steadiest sources of increase to the labor force was workers who were 55 and older. We really don't have that same dynamic, even though quite a few who retired early during the pandemic have flowed back into the workforce. And on top of that, you have some of the lowest income earners that may never come back into the workforce because the social safety net, as I like to call it, sources of support for the lowest income earners have grown appreciably since the pandemic hit, meaning what we're looking at in the current layoff cycle is a much different construct than what we've seen in past recessions. In other words, in the past, you would see layoffs begin with the lowest income earners, and we're not seeing that. We're seeing white collar, and in fact, the Financial Times coined the term just a few days ago. We're seeing a white collar recession. We're seeing layoffs start at the top of the income ladder, as well as what that comes with, lots of severance packages. So we're not seeing it manifest as quickly in the jobless claims data as we would otherwise, because so many people are getting what we call golden parachutes as they go out the door. When you think about what happened after the pandemic hit, that you had multiple generations, because you actually had a lot of baby boomers who were thinking that they were going to move into city centers and that they were going to be hip and age closer to hospitals and be closer to their millennial children. They put those plans indefinitely on hold. They stayed in the suburbs and in the exurbs. At the same time, your typical urban dweller moved outside of the city, got a mortgage and all the maintenance that goes along with owning a home, bought a car for the first time. Now they've got all of these fixed payments, if you will. And a lot of companies have called workers back to the office. So you're right to point out that it is going to be more, we will see more of a real effect on the economy because some of the highest income earners who spend more than the lowest income earners, by definition, are going to be financially strapped because they do have financial obligations that they might not have had the pandemic not hit, and had they still been renters in urban city centers with no car payment. Then we won't be polite. I think it's asinine. Look, the idea that you should punch the clock, that you should do the bare minimum, it's not even American. We are a country that became great because of our work ethic, because we did give it our all. And the idea of just FaceTime, showing up, doing the minimum. I mean, for heaven's sake, put yourself in the position of being a parent. I have 4 kids. Would I ever raise my children to say, you know what? You need to aspire to be mediocre. You need to do the bare minimum. No, you want your children to succeed. You want your children to do better than you've done. And you try and instill those virtues in them, not to grow up and be a quiet quitter. So, it's a reflection, I think, of the empowerment of the worker. And don't get me wrong. I think that private equity has had a terrible influence, as has corporate CEO pay, just running off the rails, greed, having so much money filter through to the C-suites and paying one-time dividends to these private equity kingpins, as I call them. I think that there is imbalance between what the executives make compared to what their workers make. And that does need to be resolved. But you don't need to swing the pendulum all the way to the opposite side and suggest that mediocrity is acceptable. It's interesting to see that the idea of a soft landing has made a roaring comeback just in the past few weeks, and you're hearing more and more about it. I think it's fanciful thinking. I really do, because when you hear on the same day that the NASDAQ was up 7.5%, when you hear about companies like Amazon, the nation's second largest employer, coming out and saying, we're going to be looking at a major restructuring. That's code word for huge layoffs. And what we saw, the irony of all of this is that April 28th, I have that date in my mind for whatever reason, but April 28th was the day that Amazon originally made their 2022 originally made their announcement that they were going to be reducing their payroll by 100,000 workers. Now, this was not like Armageddon moment, because since the pandemic, they increased their headcount by 800,000. That being said, the minute Amazon made that initial announcement in April, we started seeing other corporations follow suit. That's really when the layoff announcements picked up. Now that we're seeing Amazon come back and say we're looking at a major restructuring, now I think you will see other companies again follow suit, because we do live in a competitive world. Many companies overhired during the pandemic. There was this grab for labor, and I think we're going to see that begin to reverse, which is going to put an idea of a soft landing, I think, out to pasture. I think so few of us are accustomed to the type of Federal Reserve that we're experiencing now. We're used to a malleable Federal Reserve. We're used to a Federal Reserve that did what investors deemed they needed. Catch my back, make sure I don't lose any money. There's only a reward for taking risk. I think that Jay Powell is exemplifying that he is of a different cut. And this is really difficult for us to get our heads around, because when push came to shove in 2018, he did bend to the market's will. He did pivot. And that's why I think that the conventional wisdom is that we're going to see him pivot again. So far, that's not been the case. He really has behaved differently than the Jay Powell of 2018 when he was first in office. And he does seem determined to get the Fed funds rate, the overnight rate, up to 4.5%, 5%. And if we listen to him, he plans on keeping it there. Again, we don't have a playbook. We don't know how to behave in such an environment, because for the last 40 some odd years, it hasn't been the way that the Federal Reserve is. And that really is, when you consider the magnificent pace at which we're seeing home prices reverse and come back down, or if you're talking about used car prices, these were some of the biggest drivers of inflation on the way up. This is a lawyer by training. He's a pragmatic person. He's not a PhD in economics. He can read the headlines as well as any of us. He's a very hardworking person. Maybe he knows what we know, that there will be a reversal in inflation. And if that's the case, then why is he being as adamant as he is about continuing on this tightening pace and keeping monetary policy tighter than it would be otherwise, unless he had a different goal in mind? And that's kind of by process of elimination where I come to this theory that, you know what, maybe Jay Powell's trying to kill the Fed put. Maybe he's trying to break the back of speculation once and for all, so that it's the Fed, truly an independent, apolitical entity, that is making monetary policy, and not speculators making monetary policy for the Fed. So the general reaction is one of, let me think of a word here, pity. Danielle is delusional, because he's eventually going to have to break. And there is something to be said for that. There is a lot of logic there. You're not allowed to be a central banker if you let systemic risk run wild. It's just a big no-no. So I'm sympathetic to that mind frame. But what if I'm only half right? And what if he keeps monetary policy tighter than anything we've seen up to a limit? That's still going to have ramifications for the investing world and for the economy. What if he just puts half the zombie corporations into their graves? That's still going to it's still going to leave a lasting mark. So I understand that we have debt to GDP in the United States that's much higher than what it was when Paul Volcker was in office. And I can do the math. I can see the data. That being said, he does appear to be determined, and he has brought into line a lot of traditionally dovish Fed officials to echo what he's saying about the need to keep interest rates higher for longer than what we're accustomed to, which is a lower for longer existence.